They say the Mississippi keeps secrets better than any confessor. That claim felt like gospel until a humid August night in 1847, when the river learned that some truths claw their way to the surface no matter how heavy the silt. Near Baton Rouge at the Bogard Plantation, the world tilted. For a few hours the air thickened, the crickets forgot their song, and even the paddle wheelers on the far channel seemed to hush their churn as if engines could fear. It began with a figure in white. At 3 a.m, 23 witnesses would later swear they saw the same sight. Men on patrol, a sleepless child peering through a cabin crack, a cook who had risen early for dough, even a pair of field hands cooling their burned palms along the fence rail. They all saw Mrs. Charlotte Bogard lifted from the slave quarters and carried toward the main house. Her nightgown clung to her skin and bore dark stains that did not look like mud. Her eyes were open but vacant, pupils swallowed by a milky tide, as if someone had reached in and unplugged the light behind them. Those who touched her spoke of a shock in the fingertips, a fizz under the nails, the brief, dizzy feeling of standing where you should not be. By dawn, the story had already started to vanish. That was the habit of power in East Baton Rouge Parish. Records could grow legs and wander off. Deputies could mishear. Memory could be bribed by comfort or ground down by fear. The sheriff wrote a single page that night. 2 days later, the page was gone. The parish priest made notes in a cramped hand, then denied ever putting pen to paper. He kept silent for 40 years and died with a jaw clenched tight enough to crack a molar. Within a week, every person who had been inside the quarters was sold away to distant states, their names rewritten in ledgers, their kin left to stare at empty doorways. Yet the land did not forget. The Bogard place sat high above the river road. The house rose 3 stories, a white ribcage of columns gleaming under sun so harsh that heat wavered like breath above the steps. 22 rooms held Paris furniture and portraits with eyes that followed you. But it was the map of the grounds that mattered. Most planters pushed the quarters far off near the fields. Senator Theodore Bogard had arranged them in a horseshoe around a central building that everyone called the keeping house. That room with low rafters and a single tall window was used for births and for sickness. It was used for the work that domestic servants did not speak of, where other ears could listen. Mostly it was used for what the enslaved whispered about with heads bent and voices low. They called it the place where spirits gather in their own languages that white people neither learned nor wished to learn. That summer the air weighed heavy as a hand pressed over a mouth. The sugar boiled, the magnolia bloomed, and a strange fever stalked both quarters and big house. Bodies burned and then went cold. 7 people died in July. The parish doctor called it yellow fever, though in private he confided that it moved wrong, like music in an unfamiliar time signature. It was a slow drum and then a quickening. It chased dreams and left frost behind the eyelids. He had gentle hands and a careful notebook. One day his grandson would find those pages and read them with a shiver. Theodore Bogard stood at the apex of a world that believed itself eternal. He was 45, owned 3,000 acres of the sweetest black earth in the parish, and claimed 137 enslaved people by right of a pen stroke. His mill spat white crystals by the barrel. His voice in the state senate carried weight on roads, levies, and punishments. Baton Rouge had newly taken the title of capital, and men like Theodore practiced the art of power the way their wives practiced the piano. All scales, all posture, all performance. Charlotte, 20 years younger, was the jewel of that performance. In drawing rooms, she laughed lightly in French, quoted philosophers in Latin, and surprised everyone with words from West African tongues that she claimed had been lullabies from a nurse in her Charleston childhood. She had a mind that sparkled. She read history and medicine and did not hide it. People said she was an ornament to the city. Others quietly called her a problem that would not stay inside the frame built for her. In July, she began to walk at dusk toward the quarters. She said she brought medicines and food, a good Christian at work. Theodore waved off concern. A session in New Orleans was gathering steam, and the talk was all railroads and paper and how to fold the river into a ledger. On August 15, he hosted a dinner to flatter allies. A judge arrived in glossy boots. A planter from Ascension came with a laugh like a breaking log. Father Bernard from St. Joseph offered a blessing over white tablecloth and venison. The men retired to brandy and a map of districts. Charlotte excused herself with a pressed hand to her temple and went upstairs. Her maid, a woman the ledger called Mary Housemaid, age 30, waited in the doorway and watched her mistress pace a track in the carpet. The woman's true name was Marie Claire, and she observed much while speaking almost nothing. She would one day trade her silence for the price of freedom. That night she heard the mistress mutter in a tongue she could not place. Not French, not English, not any of the sweet harsh syllables of the quarters. At 11, Charlotte dismissed her for the night. That had never happened before. The overseer on duty later claimed he saw a figure in white slip from the side door and drift toward the keeping house, a leather satchel at her hip. He called out. The figure did not pause. He said later that she moved with an odd decisiveness, like a marionette pulled by a hand no one could see. He used the word unnatural, then stared at his boots and wished he had chosen another. Samuel, whose hands were split by Cain and whose voice carried a hymn as easily as a sack, sat closest to the central building that night. He heard singing rise from the keeping house. Not the common hymns with their call and response. Something older. The melody climbed and dipped and held a note so long the boards creaked like they were remembering another purpose. Celia, the midwife, would tell a traveler years later that she was inside with a sick young woman when Charlotte came through the door exactly at midnight. The leather satchel was full. The room warmed. Celia said Charlotte looked like herself and yet did not. Her eyes showed white, yet she seemed to see perfectly, turning to each voice before it spoke. The words that followed braided languages like strands in a cord. Charlotte spoke in Yoruba, perfectly shaped syllables none of them had ever heard from her. She took items from the satchel that Celia would refuse to name. She set them in a pattern along the packed dirt floor. She drew signs that stung the eyes and made the air in the throat taste of iron. The song grew. The call and response returned, but with a rhythm from deeper memory. The heat in the room climbed until water fell from the walls like sweat. At 3, the sound stopped. Silence rushed in so hard that men in the yard swore they heard the thud of their own hearts. Then a scream rose from the woodwork itself, or so Samuel said later before they sold him to a Texas man who had no patience for stories. The door flew wide. Charlotte stumbled out. Her nightgown was a script of stains. She convulsed in the dust and then went still. The big house emptied. Lamps bobbed. Feet hammered planks that had been polished by generations of fear. Judge Treadwell reached the yard just as the senator arrived with Father Bernard, and a clutch of guests clutching brandy glasses like talismans. They saw a woman on the ground, a circle in front of the keeping house trampled by many feet, and a room beyond that breathed heat like a kiln. They saw faces watching from doorways, eyes too wide, bodies poised to flee. Charlotte was carried to her bed. The doctor came. He had little to offer but laudanum, a basin, and a listening ear. What he recorded was terrible in its intimacy. The patient burned and froze by turns. Her skin showed markings that were not wounds but something like growth from within. A faint script that tightened and faded and shifted. Her mouth filled with words in no language he owned, though now and then he heard a name that belonged to someone from the quarters. When he pressed his ear to her belly, he flinched as if stung. By sunrise, Theodore had chosen a path. The keeping house burned before noon. A cooking fire was blamed. The story walked on 2 legs and wore a smile. Every person who had stepped inside that room in the night was sold within days. Wagons came. Paper passed hand to hand. Doors in the quarters stood open. Beds stripped. Children's palms pressed silent to their mouths. The overseer was dismissed with a generous purse. He told himself he was lucky to leave with a living body and a tongue still in his head. But even a world built on forgetting cannot outvote the ground beneath it. Among the enslaved people, whispers moved like water along roots. They whispered that Charlotte had been seen near the quarters for weeks with small parcels and careful questions. They whispered that she had visited an elder woman called Mama Shara, who had been born in Haiti and carried the memory of mountains in her eyes. That woman had lain down 2 weeks before the night in question and announced that sunset would be her last. Charlotte was present at her passing. Some said she held the old woman's hand. Some said the old woman held hers. Father Bernard would write a single letter that was not meant for the parish files. It would travel to New Orleans and then to Rome. In it, he said he had heard the woman name angels that were not in Scripture, and speak rites that belonged to a time before the flood. He said she recited the contents of sealed church documents with impossible accuracy. He asked whether such knowledge could come from a mind given over to illness. There was a transfer the next month. He did not return to Baton Rouge. 2 weeks after the night of the keeping house, Charlotte rose from bed with clear eyes. She remembered nothing. She smiled. She served tea. She went to church. She avoided the ashes where the central building had stood. Now and then, watched from a distance, she drew patterns in the air with her fingers. Now and then her lips moved in silent rehearsal of a language that seemed to breathe through her. The ground kept its own counsel. The air near the ruins held a low hum that some dismissed as the wind, and others refused to stand and hear. At the edge of the quarters, children would play a game that ended each time the sun struck a certain angle, because at that angle, a shadow crossed the old foundation and made even brave mouths fall quiet. The river ran past, brown and glittering, and to those who listened at night it sounded a little like a choir holding a note too long. Baton Rouge woke each morning and chose its denial with care. Men spoke of levies and seats and votes. Women spoke of ribbons and rivulets of cream. The enslaved spoke to each other when there were no ears to punish them. They said the land remembered. They said a circle had been broken, and someone had tried to mend it. They said the fever had stopped that very night and had not returned. There were footprints left in the dirt outside the keeping house before the fire. No one recorded them officially, yet men who stood at the edge and squinted told the same odd thing. The prints overlapped in sizes like a timeline laid unfolded on the ground. Child, a young woman, a matron, a bent elder. The same foot, the same bones, walking through its own life all at once. The earth had taken those shapes and kept them until the first hard rain. The story of that night was not a ghost story. Not yet. It was a bruise under a silk sleeve. It was an ache behind the eye. It sat in the middle of the Bogard marriage like a candle that would not blow out. It sat in the middle of the parish like a question written in water. What had Charlotte sought inside the keeping house? What had answered her? What price had been set? And what coin would be accepted by the old economy of sorrow that predated every ledger in Louisiana? By evening, the river took on the color of pewter. Bats zigzagged in the last light. In the quarters an old song began, the kind that settles the day. It was heavy with longing and as sure of itself as a plow. In the big house, the senator locked his study and drew the curtains tight. On his desk lay a note in his own hand that he did not remember writing. It held a single line. The circle turns, and somewhere in the dark, very far and unbearably near, something listened. Morning came with a blue so thin it looked torn. Smoke from the keeping house crawled along the grass and settled into the floorboards of the big house, as if it meant to stay. By noon, the ash had lost its shine. By evening, the story had already begun to change its clothes. The official tale was simple. An accident in the night. A pot left too long. A spark carried by a draft. The same tidy phrases that had been used 100 times in 100 parishes when something needed to be covered with words. Men nodded. Women pursed their lips in practiced sorrow. Paper was folded and stamped and placed in drawers. The drawers shut softly, like eyelids. In the rooms above the river road, the truth would not lie still. Charlotte slept as if crossing a wide, dark sea. Sometimes her lips moved. Sometimes her fingers traced invisible lines on the sheet. When the doctor pressed his hand to her wrist, he felt a pulse that was not a single drum, but a choir. Quick voices layered over a slow one. He listened at her chest and heard the body argue with itself. He wrote in his notebook with a hand that shook, and then tore out the page and hid it under a folded shirt in his case. Later he would copy the words again, as if a second writing might fix what he had seen into something the mind could hold. Theodore did what men like him had always done when the world refused to behave. He reached for order like a weapon. The central building was already a ruin. He ordered it razed to bare earth. He had new fences marked. He sent riders. He sent letters. He sat with a lawyer until the candles guttered, and every name that had stood inside that room at midnight had a price attached to it. By the end of the week, wagons rattled down the lane and out through the live oaks. Children stared at the road until it turned, then stared at the dust that lingered as if dust might turn and look back. The quarters learned how a story can be heavy enough to bend a life. The faces that had watched Charlotte carried out of the heat began to vanish. Doors sighed open and stayed that way. On a hot afternoon, Samuel was marched away with 2 others. He kept his shoulders square, then looked once toward the river, and made a small sign with his hand that only Celia understood. Mary Housemaid, who signed the ledger with an X but wrote her real name carefully when no one watched, stood to the side and did not cry, because some griefs do not allow the luxury of tears until much later. Father Bernard returned to the parish house and wrote one letter that did not belong in any record book. He chose his words as if they might cut him on the way out. He wrote that Charlotte had spoken names for angels that were not in any catechism. He wrote that she had described texts he had only heard elders whisper about behind locked doors. He wrote that she had laughed softly, the laugh of a woman who knew a secret and did not need your permission for it to be true. The letter went south to New Orleans, then farther, and the priest was sent to a parish where the swamp grew closer to the steps, and the bell rope was frayed. He took his silence with him like a penance, the fever that had burned July like a brand lifted as if on a hinge. No new cases. Those who had trembled and sweated and slipped toward death sat up and asked for water with a clear voice. Mothers touched foreheads and found them cool. The doctor wrote this down as well and underlined it. Later he would cross out the line, then underline the ghost of it again. In the big house, Charlotte woke. She smiled with a softness that made the maids look away. She asked for tea. She thanked the doctor. She did not ask about the keeping house, and no one brought it to her. When she walked the gallery, her shadow lay thin behind her, as if it did not quite belong to this particular light. She refused to step across the patch of ground where the central building had stood. Without looking down, she walked a circle around it, then another, a habit her feet learned on their own. There were changes small enough to deny if you needed to. At table she would pause for 13 heartbeats, exactly 13, then continue her sentence as if time were a thread she had set down and picked up again. She would fold a napkin, and the pattern would look like a star chart that had not been discovered yet. She would greet an elderly man from town using the name his mother had given him before he was sold away from her, a name no one had said near him for 30 years. He wept into his hat and did not know why. At night, the land moved closer to the windows. The new workers who arrived to fill the empty cabins began to hear singing where the keeping house had been. Not every night, only when the heat held and the air failed to move. The song was call and answer, then not that at all. It had the weight of a prayer that had traveled too far and would not be turned back. Tools were found out of place, a hoe standing politely where no hands had left it, a coil of rope laid in a circle that made the hair on the arms rise. In the field by the far fence, earth that should have been cool at dawn was warm to the touch, as if breath lived under it. Theodore worked longer, his pen scratched through midnight. He read statutes and cases and then stared past them. He stopped looking into mirrors, claiming they showed him other rooms than the one he stood in. Servants found letters in his desk addressed to the dead. He answered them as if the post would deliver either way. He began to dream with his eyes open. The maid who tended the lamp saw him sit perfectly still and speak in the voice of a child that had never lived long enough to stretch its legs. She backed out of the room with the lamp held high and did not let the flame falter. In the quarters, the story changed shape again. Whispers said Charlotte had been studying long before she came to Baton Rouge. Whispers said she carried a satchel across the ocean that did not weigh what its size suggested. Whispers said Mama Shara had taught her to listen to the oldest parts of the earth, the parts that remember each prayer buried in them, and each promise broken above them. The old woman had lain down and told the sunset goodbye. The younger woman had watched and learned what a boundary looks like when it opens. Mary began to write when she could, small pages hidden in the lining of a work dress. She wrote a list of names that were not the ledger names, the true names that mothers speak against their babies' foreheads. She wrote what she had seen on the night of heat. She wrote the way the air in the keeping house had pressed on her skin, as if the world itself had moved closer by an inch. She wrote the pattern of stains on the nightgown, because some scripts are not ink, and later you need to remember the shapes exactly. The river kept its counsel, but at the bank where the willow dipped, fishermen said the current bent around a place that had not been there the week before, as if water refused a small circle of air. They cast lines anyway and pulled up nothing but weeds that looked like hair. They cut the lines and left, saying nothing at all, because men who live by water learn early that some details are not for daylight. On a Sunday afternoon, the senator opened his mouth in the state chamber and spoke with force about punishments for unsupervised gatherings among the enslaved. His colleagues nodded, hearing an old fear in a new suit. He used the language of order and roads and safety. The words sounded like bricks. No one noticed how his hands shook when he sat down, or the way he avoided the strip of sunlight that lay across the floor like a blade. The parish pretended itself back into shape. Wives drove into town for sugar and ribbons. Men rode along the levee and tipped their hats. The quarters hummed with work and with a second music that did not belong to the day. Children learned a game that involved turning in a circle and saying a sentence backward. When they reached a certain point, they all fell down at once and burst into laughter that arrived too hard and then ended too fast. They did not know why the game felt borrowed. Then the mirrors began. At first, it was only a visitor in the guest room. He was shaving when the glass breathed a fine mist and webbed with lines. He cursed softly and dabbed his cheek with a towel. The cracks were not random. If you looked straight on, you saw a spider and a star. If you looked slightly away, the lines formed a map that pointed north along the river, and then broke into a ladder of little rungs. 2 days later, the mirror in Charlotte's dressing room showed a similar pattern, only this one held a string of small handprints, each the size of a sparrow. The maid covered it with a cloth and crossed herself. She did not tell her mistress why her breath had turned cold. On the 3rd week, as dusk settled violet on the cane, a field hand named Joshua saw Charlotte stand in the exact center of the south field with her arms lifted to the light. He blinked and she was gone. He ran to the house to repeat what he had seen and met Charlotte coming down the stairs with a tray of tea. Steam curled from the cups. She smiled and thanked him for holding the door. He set the tray on a side table with hands that had suddenly forgotten their strength. The doubling began to have witnesses. 2 women in the kitchen swore they saw the mistress cross the back gallery and enter the yard, while the mistress stood at the stove stirring milk. A boy herding chickens told Celia that he watched her kneel by Mama Shara's grave in the little cemetery at the same hour she played a hymn in the parlor. The boy did not know enough to be afraid of his own words. Celia did. She pinched his ear gently and said the thing that keeps you safe. Pray quiet. Work steady. Keep your eyes on the ground when the ground starts to sing. Late one night, the doctor returned for a last look before he told himself to stop coming. He placed his ear to Charlotte's belly with the same careful respect he would offer a sacred book. The sound he heard ran the blood from his face. It was not a heartbeat. It was many. They rose and fell out of time with each other. A rain on different roofs, a congregation in different pews. He stood up too fast and had to grip the bedpost. Charlotte smiled at him with polite concern and asked if he had been eating. He lied and said yes. He walked home under a sky that felt too low and sat on his porch until morning. When his wife asked what troubled him, he said the word nothing. The first lie that any husband learns, and felt it sit in his mouth like a stone. The day after, Theodore ordered fresh paint for the columns and new curtains for the parlor. He told the overseer to hire a fiddler for Saturday night, because music brings a house back to itself, and told himself this twice to make it true. He wrote to a colleague in New Orleans about rail expansion, and then wrote to his dead father, asking what a man owes to land, to names, to the living who stand within reach, and the dead who stand just behind them. He sealed both letters and addressed both. The ground around the former keeping house went bare and stayed bare. Grass tried to take, then thought better of it. Birds that loved fence rails avoided that circle by a careful wing length. Once at noon, a cloud slid across the sun and the temperature in that patch dropped until breath showed. A laborer passing by put his hand to his chest without knowing why, and whispered the first part of a prayer he had not said since he was 8. Charlotte did not go near it. From the far edge, she would raise her palm as if counting. 1, 2, 3, then lower her hand and turn away. On the evening that marked 2 weeks since the fire, she stood on the gallery and watched night pour itself into the yard. She held a shawl close despite the heat. The river muttered. Somewhere a fox barked. A window behind her, the mirror cracked along a new line that pointed east and then down. the way a finger points when it wants you to listen to something under your feet. The house exhaled. The parish went to sleep. The circle held. Nothing happened, which is a sentence that lies because in the deep parts of night when people breathe evenly and furniture settles and the dog lifts his head for no reason, the ground speaks in the slow grammar of roots and stone. It uses the old verbs, remember, return, and over that whisper, faint at first, another voice had begun to walk. It was the step of a stranger on a wooden corridor. It was the turn of a book page in a library where no one had been for years. It was the creak of a hotel stair. By the time anyone heard it clearly, the stranger would already be in Baton Rouge, carrying questions that would pry open the careful lid the senator had nailed shut. The circle turns, the note on Theodore's desk had said. The circle does not ask permission. The first anyone saw of him was a figure on the St. Charles Hotel veranda, thin as a fence slat and still in the heat, studying the street as if it were a page in a book. He arrived on a paddle wheeler that coughed steam like a sick ox, stepped onto the plank with a carpet bag and a case for instruments, and introduced himself as Professor Augustus Brenner of Harvard College. The clerk wrote the name slowly, tasting each letter, and decided at once that this was a man who would ask for lamps after midnight. Brenner's room held a washstand, a narrow bed, and a window that watched the river. He unpacked paper, a brass compass, a magnifier with a crack like a tear in the lens, and a roll of thin charcoal rubbings that showed symbols a parish boy would have sworn belonged to an alphabet from a country no one had sailed to yet. He set his watch on the table, wound it, and listened as if time itself might offer an answer. He began with ordinary questions that did not sound ordinary when he asked them. He asked about sugar yields and levee repairs, about the number of cabins on certain plantations, about the width of corridors in certain houses. He asked about the Bogard place with the same calm tone he used for the price of molasses. He never used the word scandal. He asked where the keeping house had stood, and whether the ground there drained well or held water. The clerk of the hotel liked to talk, and so did the barber, and so did a man who had seen too much river and not enough luck. Answers came like minnows, small, quick, hard to hold, but lively enough to prove a body of water was there. In the afternoons he sat in the reading room at St. Joseph's Cathedral, a square of cool air carved from the heat. The sacristan eyed him, and then eyed the letter of introduction in his hand. Father Bernard had been transferred last week. The new curate said the word irregular once and then changed it to delicate. Briner nodded as if both words meant the same thing to him. He copied lines from parish ledgers in a small, neat hand. He looked for names that had been crossed out and then written again. He looked for a shape under the writing, because every list tells two stories, the one that thinks it is true, and the one that forgot how to hide. At dusk he walked to the river and took notes on the sound of the water. He cupped the current in his palm and let it fall. He collected a pinch of silt from the ferry slip and breathed it in as if memory had a scent. He visited the market and watched a woman buy lye and salt, and then lift her head at a sound only she seemed to hear. He followed her at a distance through the lanes, lost her behind a wagon and found himself standing at a corner where the air felt a degree cooler and the world inside that coolness felt older. Then the bricks. On the third morning he hired a small carriage and a driver who did not ask questions. The road to the Bogard place curved along the levee, through a corridor of live oaks that kept their own counsel. When the gate came into view, the horses shied. The driver swore gently and steadied them. Briner felt the smallest pressure in his ears, as if weather were about to turn. He told the driver to stop short of the gate. He set his boots on the dust and walked the last yards alone, hat in hand. Up close, the land spoke, not in words. In a weight, the air above the dirt where the keeping house had stood was not the same air that hung over the lane. It had a warmth in it that had nothing to do with sun. Grass hesitated at the edges of that circle, like a choir holding a note it did not yet dare to sing. Brenner stood 1 foot inside the shade of the live oak, and 1 foot in the light. He felt a rhythm through the soles of his boots that did not match his pulse. He took out his compass. The needle quivered and leaned toward the bare patch, then leaned away, like a man trying to decide whether to enter a room where his name has been said. Behind the gate, a woman crossed the gallery and paused for a fraction too long. The way a listener pauses when a distant instrument enters the song. Brenner lifted his hat. The woman turned and was gone. From the yard, a pair of boys stared and then pretended to throw stones at a chicken, so they would have a reason for their eyes to be there. Someone inside shut a shutter with more force than shutters require. Brenner did not push past the gate. He walked the fence line as a surveyor does, slow, patient, taking angles. He stepped off distances and marked them in a little book. He knelt to touch the soil, and his fingertips came away not black but reddened, as if the earth had been flushing with some deep, embarrassed heat. He whispered a word that belonged to no church and no school, then caught himself and stood. On his way back to town, he asked the driver to stop by the colored market on the north side. He bought a packet of herbs from a woman whose face looked young until she turned her head, and her eyes said she had seen more calendars than her skin. She tilted her chin toward the professor's case and asked if the instruments inside could see what a man cannot. He told her sometimes. She told him that sometimes is not enough when the ground starts to count your steps for you. That night in the hotel, the mirror over the washstand cracked with a dry little sigh. The lines did not wander. They arranged themselves into a ladder of short rungs that climbed toward the ceiling, then turned right, then dropped. Brenner lit another lamp and drew the pattern before sleep killed it. He pressed the charcoal hard enough to darken the grain of the paper. He could hear the river through the open window, a sound like low speech. At 2 a.m, a steamboat whistle cried, and the mirror lines shivered and then held, like a map fixing itself. In the morning, he ate 1 egg and half a biscuit, and wrote 3 letters. One to a colleague in Boston who tolerated his interest in subjects not yet respectable. One to an acquaintance in Paris who moved with ease among small libraries that belonged to men who liked to speak of themselves as collectors and preferred not to speak of the hands that had gathered their collections. One letter he did not address. He folded it twice and slid it into the lining of his coat. It began with the words, "If you are reading this, then I stood where the ground remembered me." He went back to the cathedral. The sacristan had things to do and did them loudly in the next room. Brenner opened a book of baptisms and traced his finger along the margins, where pencil notes had been made and erased and made again. He found a line in a careful hand that referred to a woman in 1815 who had spoken a language no one claimed to know and whose body had shown signs that looked like writing that came from under the skin. The note did not use the word miracle. It did not use the word curse. It used a phrase that had the cool weight of the clerk who wrote it. Case closed by transfer. He copied the line and wrote beside it a single word, pattern. On the steps he met a maid carrying a market basket. She kept her eyes down and set her foot on the 3rd stair and paused one breath too long. He knew a pause when he saw one. He tipped his hat and let the moment pass. Her face matched a description he had written from 3 different mouths. Her ledger name was Mary. Her true name had more syllables and more history. She turned away and he watched the fold of her dress swallow the corner where she had hidden a thin notebook. He looked down at his shoes so she would not see that he had seen. At sunset, he returned to the Bogard road with no carriage. He went on foot and stopped again short of the gate. The world holds its breath at that hour, when the last birds speak. A breeze came off the river and then stopped, as if something had put out a hand. The live oaks lifted their moss like old men lifting long hair from their necks. From within the grounds came the faintest rise and fall of voices, the kind of music that is not sung so much as remembered. Brenner took 1 step forward. He felt the feeling men describe in battle when they realize the shot they hear belongs to them. His stomach turned. His knees forgot about pride. He sat on the packed earth and breathed through his teeth until the wave passed. In that moment he heard a sound from the bare patch where the keeping house had stood. It was a heartbeat, and it was not one. It was many, all slightly out of time, like rain on tin scattered across a town. A child laughed somewhere inside that rhythm. The laugh came from very near and very far, the way river sound does in fog. He stood, wiped dust from his palms, and walked back in a straight line without looking over his shoulder. On the veranda of the hotel, he wrote a sentence he would remember until his last breath. "The land is counting, Theodore." Bogard received a note the next day in a careful northern hand that requested a meeting about agricultural inquiry and labor accounting. He stared at the note until the words blurred. He pictured the man at his gate and felt both a thread of relief and a fist of panic. He folded the paper and placed it under the brass paperweight shaped like a sugar loaf. Then he called for the overseer and used a voice that had always brought other men to heel. "See where he goes. Ask nothing. Bring me only his footprints." In the upstairs room, Charlotte tied the curtains back and let the morning in. She dipped a pen and began to embroider an alphabet on linen for a child not yet born. The pattern curved into shapes that hurt the eye if you stared directly. She did not know why her hand moved the way it did. She did not know why the soft knock she heard next, the knock she would later swear came from inside the wall, made her look toward the corner where the paper was peeling in a curve like the edge of a map. In the yard, the bare circle held its line. Birds avoided it. Ants went around it. At midnight that night, in the cathedral reading room where no one now sat, the lamp by the ledger guttered and steadied. The ink on a certain page darkened for the length of one slow breath, as if someone had leaned close. When the flame rose again, a single new word had appeared in the margin in a small northern hand. Balance. Morning in Baton Rouge wore a pale glaze, the kind that looks gentle until you notice how it sticks to the lungs. The city made its usual sounds, carts and gulls and a river voice lowered for prayer, yet beneath the noise ran a slow drum that cared nothing for markets or manners. The ground had more to say, and it had chosen its listeners. Professor Brenner woke before the bell at St. Joseph. He studied the drawing he had made of the cracked mirror, a ladder that rose, turned right, and dropped. He drew it again with his eyes closed to test what had lodged in memory, then tucked both sheets into the pockets sewn inside his coat. He carried famine and harvest together on his face, a scholar's hunger for pattern, and a man's fear of what pattern might demand. He went to the cathedral reading room with a nod the sacristan did not return. He opened a book of marriages and then another of burials. He traced the clerk's hands, the careful loops, the cheap ink darkening to brown, the places where a name had been lifted out like a splinter and replaced by a cleaner word that did not hurt as much to look at. He found again the line about a woman in 1815, languages she should not have known. Writing that seemed to grow from under the skin. Case closed by transfer. He wrote the word pattern once more, then set the pen down and pressed his thumb against the blot. On the steps he met the maid with the market basket. A glance, a breath held a fraction too long, a choice made. He followed at a distance, never quickening his stride, and watched the way she kept to the shade where vines draped and the heat thinned. She turned into a narrow lane, where laundry lines sagged with white work shirts and a child's dress that had been mended twice. She stopped by a side door and set down her basket without looking back. He stopped well short of her and took off his hat. "You are the one who listens," she said, still facing the door. "I am the one who writes," he answered. "Listening weighs more," she said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. They spoke in sentences that could have been about nothing at all. She told him the price she would ask before she spoke plain. It was not money. It was a name, not his, a name that had been folded into a ledger under a smaller name, and then shipped 2 states away on a wagon that squeaked like a thing in pain. She told him the year. She told him the river bend. She told him what the boy had been called by the woman who birthed him, and how she had pressed that name against his forehead, like a seal before a driver pulled him loose. He repeated the name until his mouth knew its weight. He promised to look. "You promised to find," she said, and finally turned to face him. "Promise is not the same as try." He bowed his head. "I promised to find." She nodded, satisfied not by his words but by what had moved beneath them. "My ledger name is Mary. You will not use it." "I'm Marie Claire." He said the name in full and felt how it held. She opened the door and they sat on 2 low stools in a square of cool shade that smelled of soap, iron, and mint. She did not touch him. She kept her hands spread flat on her knees, as if the earth beneath them might forget who she was if she let go. "Your mistress," he said, and did not finish the sentence. "She is not mine," Marie Claire said. "But I know the shape of her shadow." She told him what she had seen the night of heat. The leather satchel, the things that should not exist in a Christian world, the way the room had sweated even at the rafters. She told him the sound of the song, not the tune, the weight of it, and he felt the hair on his forearms lift. She told him what had happened afterward. The selling, the doors left open to the heat, the way a little girl stood with her hands under her chin, as if that could keep sorrow from running out of her mouth. "Before that night," he asked, "what did she study? Everything, Marie said. But not in the way men mean when they praise a woman for reading. She studied by listening. She let the oldest parts of this place speak through what people had left on it. Soil, water, bone. A lock of hair saved too long. She knew where to stand and when to be silent. She learned that from Mama Shara. At the name, the room itself seemed to lean closer. Marie went on. Mama Shara showed her that the land remembers each cut and each song, and that memory needs a door. Some doors you build with words. Some you build with silence used like a tool. The woman from the big house could learn both ways. She walked down from that gallery at dusk and did not hold her skirts like a shield. She carried a satchel that was always heavier than it looked. What was in it? Names, Marie said. Not written, kept, he waited. She watched him. At last she nodded once. She had personal things from every person she meant to call into that room. A button a mother had saved from a coat. A string that had tied a child's hair. A crumb of soot from an iron that had scorched one woman's apron when she learned she was free in her mind and still bound by the book. She took dirt from 7 places on the high ground and 7 near the river. She drew water when the current told her to. She knew our true names and when to say them, not the ones men had written. The ones we carry under the tongue, Brenner wrote quickly and then forced himself to slow. The words had another shape beneath them, and he did not want to break it by pressing too hard. Why, he asked. To what end? She said the circle was broken when one set of people cut their own place into the world and did not ask the old place for leave or counsel. She said the land would rot like a wound covered with clean cloth and no herbs. She said there was a circle between old world and new, between living and the other things, and it needed closing. Marie glanced to the door and down the lane. Do you have what you promised? She asked. Not yet. Then you have what I promised, she said, and her voice thinned. You have enough to be careful and not enough to be safe. He stood and gave a small, awkward bow. You have given more than enough. You have not heard the worst, she said, and that quiet, cool room shivered as if heat had found it. Say it. She was not alone. She was never alone. She spoke to women in parlors that looked like paintings. They poured tea while they named stars and roots and saints. They built a net with black thread that no man could see even when it lay on his sleeve. They did not speak of it to each other in rooms where men could listen. They spoke through letters in bookshelves and in patterns on quilts, and in the way a fan opens and closes. You will find their marks if you look sideways. He swallowed. How many? Enough that when one place tipped toward sickness, another place knew to lean the other way, Marie said. Enough that if you stand in Baton Rouge and look far, you can feel a pull from Natchez and another from Savannah, and another from a piece of Carolina so wet the road swims as you walk it. He closed his notebook. He had enough for a new chapter in a book that had not existed yesterday. He also had a sentence that walked behind his ear like a fly. Not safe. He set money on the stool. She did not look at it. I will bring you the boy's true name, he said. I will find him if he breathes. Bring it to the woman who sings in the red scarf by the North Ferry on market day, she said. Do not bring it to my door. Do not write it in a book. Names change shape when ink holds them wrong. He left her there in the square of shade. When he turned at the mouth of the lane, she had already become another piece of the street. Laundry, a door, a basket, a pair of quiet hands. He would not see her again for many days. That same noon, Theodore stood at his study window and watched a hawk hang over the bare patch where the keeping house had been. The bird dipped once and then climbed with a jerk, as if it had met a wall. He closed the curtains and found that his hand shook on the cord. In the drawer were 2 letters from the stranger at the hotel. One asked about sugar. The other did not say what it wanted. He wrote an answer to the first and placed it carefully under the sugar loaf paperweight. The second he folded twice and put in his pocket as if paper could burn a hole there and teach a man to walk a different direction. He did not sleep that night or the next. The maids put plates down and he forgot to touch them. He wrote in his journal with a pen that spat blots. English gave way to French and then to Latin and then to lines of marks that might have been letters in a lost language or might have been a man tearing the world into strips and arranging the pieces because order is a drug he could no longer buy. In the margins he drew what looked like a building whose rooms did not fit together on a single plane. He labeled one wall with the words load bearing sorrow and underlined them twice. The mirrors continued their quiet rebellion. A shaving glass in a guest room cracked and presented a tiny map of river bends that matched a sketch an Underground Railroad conductor would make many years later. The large mirror in the front hall wrinkled, like a pond brushed by a fish and then settled, with a spider line that traced a path from Baton Rouge across swamps and pine lands to a door in New Orleans no gentleman would admit he knew. No visitor saw the lines unless they looked from the corner of the eye. If they tried to stare, the image dissolved and left only a headache and the taste of iron in the mouth. Dr. Henley kept his hands steady for as long as he could. He measured pulse and listened to breath and told himself the rules still held. Then he placed a stethoscope on Charlotte's belly and heard the many heartbeats again, the congregation of hearts, each with its own small story. He lifted the bell, set it on the nightstand, and stepped back until the wall touched the back of his head. He wanted to laugh and could not remember how. He told her she was recovering well, and in saying this he felt like a man on a riverboat telling passengers that the river is known and obedient while watching a new current open in plain view. Charlotte smiled with a sweetness that made him ache for reasons that had nothing to do with desire. When the doctor left, she set her hand on her abdomen and stood very still. She seemed to be listening to a distant conversation inside a house she had once lived in. After a time, she reached for a hoop and cloth and threaded a needle. She began to lay small shapes on linen, not letters, not flowers, not the ornaments that got praised at tea. The shapes connected in a way that pulled the eye, a pattern that looked wrong until you stepped back and saw it was a star map that did not belong to any current almanac. Outside, the river swung its hips and showed new eddies to men who thought they knew her every turn. On a sandbar near the ferry, a boy found a small glass vial corked and sealed with wax. Inside, he saw a smear the color of rust and a curled hair as fine as silk. He carried it to his mother, who took it and did not touch the wax. She walked to the water, spoke a single sentence in a tongue the boy had never heard, and loosened her fingers. The river took the vial like a woman taking back a gift she had not wanted to give. By the week's end, Baton Rouge hummed with talk of a new arrival at the Bogard place. No one could say who had sent her. A letter from a cousin, a mention of health in a note from New Orleans, an old connection in Charleston. Gossip wore a dozen mouths and none of them agreed. All anyone knew for certain was this: a carriage with 4 good horses rolled up the lane at noon. The gate stood open before the driver could lift a hand. The woman who stepped down wore black from head to shoe, with a veil that softened the geometry of her face. She was small but carried a gravity that made the space around her behave. A girl from the kitchen who watched from the side yard said she felt her teeth ache when the woman's foot touched the first stair. She gave her name as Madame Celeste Arsenault. She spoke in a soft voice that could be heard under the clatter of dishes and the cough of a tired man 3 rooms away. She smiled rarely, but when she did, it looked like a candle held up to a cave wall. Theodore greeted her with relief and a fear he tried to swallow. Charlotte met her in the hall, paused as if 2 mirrors had faced each other, and suddenly remembered every reflection they had ever shown. Then inclined her head as a student would to a teacher she did not remember meeting. The first request of the guest was simple and wrong. She asked for soil from 7 places on the property, the same 7 Marie had named, though neither woman had spoken to the other. She asked for water drawn at the new moon from the river's inside bend, where the current hesitates. She asked for a vial of blood from every person living on the place, enslaved and free, overseers and children, coachman and cook, senator and wife. When the overseer balked, Theodore turned a color that made the maid step back. He ordered compliance with a voice that left no room for the old joke or the small resistance. The needles that Madame Arsenault brought from her case were not like other needles. Each had a little curve. Each had markings along the shaft that looked like letters from a school no one in the parish had ever attended. She spoke to each person as she drew their blood, and eyewitnesses later could not agree on the language. Some heard Latin, some heard a French older than the city. One heard words he had not heard since a woman in Jamaica had sung to him when he was so small he still had to be carried on a hip. Several of them swore that when she looked into their faces they saw behind her head the faintest shimmer, as if a crowd had gathered and was listening through her eyes. Marie did not come to the big house for the taking of blood. She stood at the far edge of the quarters and watched the small line of people move like a slow river into a side room and then out again. She counted breaths between each person disappearing and reappearing. She named each in her head by the name that mattered. She held herself still as a tree in no wind at all. She felt the ground counting with her. In town, Professor Brenner wrote to Paris about a Haitian scholar named Dessalines, who had vanished with a collection of texts and small golden figures that did not like candlelight. He wrote to Boston about a Drayton family and the old rumor that an ancestor had escaped a charge that would have burned another woman. He pushed the letters across the desk to the clerk at the post and felt like a man building a bridge over a river that did not want a bridge. He stepped outside and felt the heat like a hand on the back of his neck. He began walking toward the ferry and the red scarf he had been told to watch for. He found her at the ferry edge, a woman with a basket and a scarf the color of a wound speaking to a man who sold rope, cut to arm lengths. Brenner stood at the end of the plank and waited without looking at her. When the rope seller moved on, the woman said without turning her head, "Bring the name on Sunday. Speak it once and hand it to the water." He nodded, "And you will hand it to who needs it." "The river hands what belongs to the river," she said. "I hand what belongs to the living." Back at the plantation, Madame Arsenault closed herself in a spare room with the shades drawn and the lamps turned low. She mixed salt with ash and something ground fine that flashed white like bone when the light caught it. She drew patterns on the floor that looked like starlight turned into geometry. She asked for 7 bowls and a strip of cloth from a baby dress that had long since fallen to threads. She spoke with Charlotte for a very long time in a murmur that made the boards under the chair creak like settling ice. Theodore paced until his footsteps wore a dull groove in a floor that had never known such rough use. The overseer avoided him because men who pace like that are looking for a place to spend a sudden anger. The house staff did their work with faces set, moving like people in a church when the priest names a sin that belongs in their own houses. No one went near the bare circle outside. Even the dogs walked around at a distance, ears laid flat, eyes lowered. Near midnight, the lamps along the gallery took on a faint green cast. The cook saw the color and thought of a childhood story about friars walking across marsh water without sinking. The youngest maid crossed herself twice. Charlotte lay in her bed with her eyes open, and the sleep that sometimes moves like a tide rolling just beneath her skin. Madame Arsenault stood by the window and watched the dark as if she expected someone to come walking out of it and knock politely on the glass. In town, Professor Brenner drew the cracked mirror ladder again and again until the charcoal broke and left streaks on his fingers. He washed his hands and could not quite get the marks to fade. He set the lamp low and lay on the narrow bed and listened to the river. He dreamed of staircases that turned in air and made a path not toward a house and not away from it, a path that felt like a reckoning, learning to walk. At the Bogard place, the clock in the hall sounded 12. Its bell was deeper than it had been last week. The sound pressed against the ribs and then let go. The night held. The ground spoke its old verbs once more. Remember, oh, return. Just before the bell sounded the half hour, Charlotte sat up in bed as if called by name. Her eyes were clear. She set her bare feet on the floor. The room was very still. Madame Arsenault did not touch her. She inclined her head the slightest degree and said a single word that did not belong to any parish. It was a word that meant both welcome and begin. On the writing table beside the bed, a pen lifted and rolled slowly until it pointed north. In the study downstairs, a paperweight shaped like a sugar loaf slid an inch and came to rest at the very edge of the letter underneath. In the quarters, a mother woke with a name on her tongue, a name she had not spoken aloud in 20 years, a name that made her sit up and press both hands to her chest like a door she did not want blown open by a hard wind. At the cathedral, the lamp in the reading room guttered and then steadied. The page that held the clerk's line from 1815 seemed to darken and then return. In the margin, beside the small northern hand that had written the word balance, another hand now appeared in a script that moved like water under light. Soon. The house learned a new kind of quiet. Not the peace of a Sunday afternoon, not the tired silence after harvest. This was a listening quiet. the pause between a question and an answer that might change the room forever. Madame Celeste Arsenault asked for a chamber away from traffic and insisted the mirrors be covered. The maids hung black cloth until the windows turned into soft, dark squares, and the glass forgot how to return a face. She sealed the frames with wax warmed over a low flame and stirred with earth brought from the cemetery. On the floor she drew with a steady hand, salt first, then ash, then a powder that flashed white like ground bone when the lamplight caught it. The lines crossed and circled and squared until the boards looked less like a room and more like a map of stars that had never been named. Charlotte sat in the center, back straight, hands open on her knees as if she listened for a voice that traveled through the grain. Madame walked the pattern in measured steps, speaking softly without ever seeming to need air. The words did not belong to any parish. They belonged to whatever language was first practiced by people who learned to speak by listening to soil and water before they tried their voices on each other. Everyone living on the property gave blood, children first, so they would not tremble after watching their mothers. Overseers and field hands, cook and coachman, senator and wife. The needles that drew the drops were etched with tiny markings that moved like letters when they met candlelight. Madame spoke to each person in a tongue that turned familiar. In the exact moment a memory rose behind the eyes. One saw his grandmother turn a bundle at a crossroads in Port-au-Prince and whisper a blessing. Another smelled the road dust of Carolina from a day when a driver shouted and the rope burned his shoulder. Several said that when Madame looked straight into them, they felt a crowd gather behind her gaze. Faces in family resemblance watched from a depth that made the skin prickle. 7 bowls waited in the prepared room, one for each soil sample, one for water drawn at the new moon from the inside bend, where the Mississippi slackens her shoulder, one for the last vial of the day. Madame set every vial on the floor, not by name in the ledger, but by true name, and the air changed shape each time the glass touched wood. Theodore tried to live inside tasks. He paced out lists with a finger and returned them to the desk when his hand began to shake. He ordered repairs that did not need making and curtain changes that no one would notice. He walked the gallery at night and counted posts. He wrote in a journal until the words ran out of letters and became lines that hooked and turned like a script no school would claim. He drew a structure with rooms that could not share the same roof. Along one wall he wrote load-bearing sorrow and underlined it until the nib tore the paper. When sleep took him, it took him hard. Lamp flames shivered to blue, and a skin of frost climbed the window panes in a parish that did not know winter, as an intimate. He slept 12 hours straight, waking with a gasp, jaw aching, the taste of iron on his tongue. The doubling grew bold. Charlotte poured tea in the parlor, while a boy at the fence saw her kneel in the cemetery and lay 2 fingers on the red dirt of a grave. A kitchen maid watched the mistress cross the yard at noon with her hands lifted to the sun, then turned and found her in the doorway asking whether the milk had burned. Witnesses learned the caution of tongues. They kept their words, yet fear traveled out of them the way heat travels out of a brick after sundown. The mirrors kept offering their thin sermons. Hairline webs and hallway glass mapped a thread from Baton Rouge toward Pineland, and farther to a door in New Orleans where brave people sought help at night. The shaving mirror in a guest room cracked from corner to corner, in a pattern that later would match a sketch of safe houses drawn by a conductor who called himself Gabriel. No one in the big house knew that name yet. The maid who trimmed the lamps knew only that looking straight at those lines made her eyes water, and her heart try to leave. In town, Professor Brenner wrote letters that felt like keys he hoped would turn in locks that had been painted shut. Paris for a Haitian scholar named Descendants, whose collection had vanished along with him. Boston for an old Charleston family with a rumor that a charge had nearly cost one of its daughters her life in another century. He returned to St. Joseph and found again that clerk's margin from 1815. Unknown language. Writing that rose from the skin. Case closed by transfer. In the margin where he had written balance, someone else had added a word and a hand as clean as rain. Soon. He walked to the Bogard gate at dusk on December 18 and stopped. The horses he had hired went rigid and rolled their eyes white. He stepped down and felt it, a pressure that did not belong to weather. It belonged to judgment. He tried to move forward and the world tilted. He tasted bile. He gripped the fence and slid to the dust. Whisper in the ear, not a voice. A certainty with words hanging from it like leaves. The child in shadow is feeding on borrowed time. Travelers found him an hour later with dust on his coat and a sentence he could not stop saying. He slept in the hotel as if sleep were a river that carried him whether he wished to go or not. In his dream, a staircase turned in air. He climbed without rising and descended without falling. When he woke, his fingers were black with charcoal he did not remember lifting. That same night at the plantation, all flame picked up a faint green hue. Kitchen lamps, bedroom candles, the lantern by the stable. Even the fire set under the washing copper showed a rim of color that made the water look too deep. Shadows gathered in door frames and corners with the hush of a congregation that knows the hymn and is waiting for its note. Dogs paced wide circles and would not cross the old keeping house foundation. A rooster crowed at the wrong hour and then fell silent forever. Madame Arseno kept her precise walk. Around and in toward Charlotte, then out again. She spoke words that sounded like rope knotting and untying in the hands of a person who had never once lost track of an end. Charlotte's face showed calm. Her eyes watched something at a distance that made her mouth soften. When she closed them, a wind seemed to pass through the room, though the sealed windows did not stir. In the quarters, people woke from the same dream. A small child with a changing face walked the row and touched each door. Behind those touches came knowledge that did not arrive by hearing it from another mouth. A woman woke knowing the true name of a sister sold to a Natchez trader 15 years earlier, and the first road to take if she ever dared to go. A man woke knowing which overseer talked big and which one killed in a quiet way. A girl woke with a lullaby in a language her mother had not dared sing out loud since she was herself a small child. The world inside the world tilted, and the tilt made strange sense. On December 20, a pale sun climbed a sky the color of the underside of a fish. Charlotte came down to breakfast and poured tea. She waited until the cups were set and the sugar was near a hand that had begun to tremble again. She looked at Theodore, and then at the door where Madame stood with her veil lifted. Her voice was even. "I am pregnant." The doctor stared hard at the place where his notes sat under a paperweight. He had documented a body that felt full with life weeks ago, a belly that had swelled, and then softened as if tides had learned a new schedule. The statement made the room feel taller. He asked without breath what day she believed this had begun. "This morning at dawn," she said. The seed was set when the light touched earth. 9 days it will grow, 9 nights it will gather. On the 9th hour of the 10th day it will crown. The date wrote itself inside every head that listened. December 29, an old holy time for people who count veils and thresholds. Madame bowed her head the smallest degree as if confirming something she had noted in her private book. Theodore began to speak and could not find the first word. He closed his mouth on air. He reached for the sugarloaf paperweight and pushed it half an inch to convince himself that matter still obeyed him. The pen on the table rolled and stopped with its nib pointing north. The mirror in the hall trembled and held. Professor Brenner copied the date into his notebook and underlined it once. He returned to the ferry and found the woman in the red scarf folding twine. He spoke a boy's true name and the name of a river bend and the year, then placed a slip of paper in her basket without looking at her face. She did not nod. She did not thank him. She lifted the paper and tucked it under a jar of lye, as if the river itself had reached out a hand to take it back. That evening, a hush lay over the place like a linen sheet drawn over a sleeping patient. The prepared room breathed. Floor lines held their pale geometry. Bowls waited. Vials slept like glass cocoons. Charlotte returned to the center and Madame resumed her path. Outside, the bare circle where the keeping house had stood kept its edge as sharp as a blade. Birds flew a careful arc around it. Ants learned a new route. Even the wind changed step at that boundary, as if rules applied there that did not apply 5 paces away. Night fell. The river talked low. Bells in town marked hours that felt heavier than hours from other weeks. In the deep case of the sky, a star that had not drawn attention last month found courage and shone a little brighter. On the 3rd hour past midnight, the light along the gallery thinned and stretched in a way no oil lamp can teach it. Madame's voice did not rise, yet it filled the room. Charlotte breathed like a woman who had reached the ocean at last and set her feet in the water without fear. 9 days, Madame had said in that breath that was not quite a whisper. 9 nights. A calendar for a working that had begun before any clock in Baton Rouge knew what it meant to keep time. By morning, the whole parish would be walking on measured ground. By evening, the house would hold its breath and wait for a stranger's footfall on the stair. The land had asked for payment. The vessel had been chosen by those who understood both parlors and keeping houses. A line had been crossed. Behind it lay comfort. Ahead lay a birth that would not produce only a child. It would deliver a debt into the world, wearing a body that could not keep a single age for long. The 9 days began to count with a voice of their own. The house learned how to listen. The river kept the beat. Even the cane held still as if hearing footfalls that had not yet reached the lane. On the morning after Charlotte spoke her calm, terrible certainty, Madame Celeste Arseno closed the prepared room and let the floor drawings breathe like pale constellations. Lamps were trimmed low. Bowls weighted with soil and river water. Files rested in rows that were not arranged by ledger names, but by something older that the air itself recognized. Theodore tried to live inside small commands. Change these curtains. Move that chair 2 inches. Tell the coachman to oil the wheel. He wrote until ink turned to scratches. He stared into mirrors and turned away as if a stranger had stepped up behind him and borrowed his reflection. When sleep finally took him, it took him like a river takes a fallen branch. 12 hours gone. Frost glowing faint along the window panes, though winter never lived here. He woke with his jaw sore and the taste of blood in his mouth, and no memory of the sounds he had made. In the quarters, the new workers learned the shape of a place that did not wish to be learned. The bare circle where the keeping house had stood refused grass. Birds crossed it with a purposeful swerve. Antlines split and recombined to avoid its edge. Children were warned away with the kind of warning that is not shouted. The kind that makes play step quietly and laughter stop short of a certain fence rail. On the 22nd, the stablemaster Benedict made up his mind. He was a man who knew horses and weather, and what to say to men when fear came into their eyes and asked for sugar. He had served the Bogards 40 years. His old hands could braid a halter in the dark. That morning he found the courage that does not arrive with noise. He wrote a note in a careful old hand and pressed it into the palm of a boy who could run a long way without stopping to look behind. The boy went toward New Orleans by paths men with uniforms did not use. The name on Benedict's folded paper belonged to Father Jean-Baptiste Duchesne, a priest of age and gravity, who understood the Church's gentler words for horrors that do not fit in parish ledgers. He had been there in 1815 when a woman named Fortier spoke in languages no one admitted to knowing, and died 7 years later on the same calendar day she had first opened that mouth to the wind. He had kept old tools wrapped in linen and hidden behind doctrinal books. He had never forgotten how the land breathes under doctrine, and sometimes does not consent. The day held its heat like a cup holds wine. The river showed a new eddy and then pretended she had not. In town, Professor Brenner stood at the ferry with a slip of paper folded in his fist. The woman in the red scarf did not look at him. He spoke a boy's true name and the mark of a river bend and the year. He set the paper into her basket. She slid it under a jar of lye as if setting a stone back into a wall. The ferry rope creaked. Something passed between them that was not greeting and not farewell. It was an understanding of trade with the living and with the water that keeps its own account. At the plantation, the light turned late and thin. The green that had fringed the flames returned. Not bright, just enough to change the way shadows behaved. Corners filled and emptied like lungs. The hall clock spoke the hour, and each tone pushed against the ribs before it moved on. Madame walked the room in her small, precise path, and spoke in the voice of someone tying a knot that must not slip. Charlotte sat in the center with her hands open, and more than once her lips moved to answer words no one else could hear. In those nights the mirrors preached their narrow sermons. A shaving glass cobwebbed into a map that would one day match the careful chart of a conductor who signed letters with the name Gabriel. The tall front hall mirror rippled and settled with a line that pointed toward a door in New Orleans that opened only at night, and only after a phrase was spoken that had traveled across an ocean in a braid and a scar. Few in the house saw these things cleanly. The maids complained of headaches and a metallic taste. The stable boy swore he saw a corridor in the glass that did not belong to this house at all. Dawn of the 23rd arrived like a held breath finally let go. The sun lifted and the roosters crowed 4 times, then fell silent all at once. By the time the cook stepped into the yard, they lay in a perfect ring around the coop, bodies neat, eyes fixed on the same patch of sky. At noon the pigs went down together, 17 animals folding as if commanded to kneel. The stable fell silent by late afternoon. Every horse lay in straw with eyes open and mouths pulled into a grin that no human can wear without breaking their soul. Only the cattle lived, and they stood in the field and sang a sound that was not quite a lowing, a long, slow tone that had the shape of a hymn from a church that asks its prayers to work. By evening, the house had learned a new fear, the kind that walks on slippered feet and shuts doors gently. The kitchen fire burned with its thin green rim. Someone dropped a pan and did not pick it up until the echo finished speaking. People sat where they did not usually sit and faced doors they usually ignored, and kept their hands close to their knees as if the air might try to take them. Charlotte ate very little. She touched the rim of her cup. She stared at the hallway for exactly 13 beats. Then she rose with a small nod as if answering a call from a room that had not been built yet. She went upstairs. Madame remained below, standing still without leaning against any wall, as if fatigue had no hold on her at all. When Theodore climbed the staircase an hour later to check on his wife, he found the door ajar. He said her name. He stepped inside and stopped. Symbols were drawn on the plaster in strokes that looked like ash mixed with something darker. The shapes did not keep still under the eye. They shivered and reformed when looked at straight on, yet held clear if seen from the corner. The bed had been pulled aside as if by many hands that had left no prints. In the center of the room, where the floor should have been, there was not a break in the boards, not a hole that showed dirt and beams, but a perfect circle of dark. It did not reflect, it did not gleam. It pulled light inward and made the lamps blink as if they were learning to breathe. Theodore stepped to the edge with his fist closed as if holding a weapon he had forgotten to pick up. From below rose a sound that was not a voice and yet carried words. The sound braided many ages together into a single thread. He heard Charlotte as a child he had never met, laughing in a courtyard in Charleston. He heard her as the bride who had first walked this gallery with new shoes, and a small defiant smile the city took for shyness. He heard her as an old woman he would never see, breath thin, voice steady, speaking to someone in a room where the shutters were closed and the lamp was turned down low. Those voices said the same sentence in different timbres. The payment comes due, the circle completes, the child rises from the foundation of sorrow. He fell to his knees like a man who hears the diagnosis he has refused to imagine. Footsteps crowded the hall. The judge, the doctor, 2 overseers who had taken courage from a bottle and already regretted it, the maid who trimmed lamps, the senior houseman whose hands could lift a piano, and a newborn with equal care. They saw the circle and swore the lamp flames leaned toward it and then back. They heard no words, only felt the shape of words in their chests like pressure before a storm. Madame Arseno appeared at the threshold, and in that moment looked both smaller and immensely larger than any person in the room. The veil was back from her face. No one would later agree on what they saw there. Old and young at once, some said. A face that was not a single person's face, others swore. She inclined her head the width of a leaf. It is time no one asked what she meant. Some truths arrive already wearing their own answers. A search party formed in the way search parties always do, when men wish to feel they can still do something. Theodore put a pistol in his coat. Judge Treadwell took a flask and a small stoppered bottle the priest had pressed on him months ago, with the advice to pour it where the heart wants to take a step forward against all sense. Dr. Henley lifted his bag with a hand he had to look at to make sure it still belonged to him. The overseers brought lanterns and iron horseshoes and old cross pendants that had not been touched in years. Someone carried a little jar of salt. Someone else a twist of iron nails. The household moved around them, making space with faces that knew a procession when they saw one. They followed the trail out the back door and down the gallery steps. Bare footprints lay on the dust. Not one set, many, child's feet. A girl's, a young woman's slim arch, a matron's firm heel, a soft shuffle of an elder who had spent more of her life sitting than walking. All of them were the same foot, the same bones aged and unaged at once, layered like thin paper sheets held over a candle. The prince turned without hesitation toward the ruins. The night wind turned with them. The green in the flames lifted and thinned, then brightened, then learned once more how to hide. Beyond the last row of cabins stood the flat black scar of the old keeping house. Charlotte had cleared a circle there earlier, perhaps, or the circle had always been waiting, and had simply decided to be seen. Ash lay in a shape too precise for accident. The men stopped at its edge because stopping first is sometimes the only authority left to a body. The air above the foundation was warmer by a shade. The earth felt near to their boot soles, as if listening for the next word a person might dare to say. From the center of that cleaned ash, the sound rose. Not the song from August, not the quiet in the days since. It was the rustle of many presences shifting the way a congregation arranges itself just before a shared breath. Even the most stubborn of the overseers felt his mouth go dry. The judge fumbled for the little bottle and held it tight enough to whiten his knuckles. They stood and saw her, Charlotte in the old white nightgown, the script of stains washed and returned by some hand that did not belong to the laundry. The leather satchel at her side that never weighed what it looked it should. Eyes rolled white and yet seeing perfectly. Hands that moved with precision, neither frantic nor slow. Around her shapes gathered, not people exactly, and not the absence of people. They were shadows that knew their own names. Some looked like the men and women who had been sold away the week after the first night. Some looked like the fever victims with the waver of heat above their shoulders. Some looked older than any record the parish had ever kept. She spoke to them. They answered with motions that traced patterns in the air. Each time she spoke a true name, a figure thickened and then thinned, as if breath were trying to return through a door too narrow. She lifted a vial and poured its contents onto ash in places that seemed random, until your gaze softened, and the pour lines slowly matched a star field no one in Louisiana would chart for 50 years. She scattered soil until the smell of river bend and high ground and graveyard rose like a complicated prayer. Dr. Henley lifted a foot to step forward, and the world told him not to. He put his foot down anyway and screamed, not from pain, but from the sight that opened in him like a window he had not known his body could hold. For a moment he knew every life that had pressed down on this place, and every death the soil had tasted, and every song that had asked the soil to remember. In that instant he understood that this was not a summoning and not a possession. It was a birth in a language older than midwives and hospitals and parish books. He fell back and gasped and could not say it yet. Later he would try. Theodore lifted the pistol and pointed it toward the white figure and the hole that was no longer under a roof, but was now under the sky. His arm shook. Charlotte's eyes came clear for a breath and found him. The sadness in them had the weight of a river. The understanding in them had the edge of a blade. "It is already done," she said, and the words came from everywhere at once, from the mouths of the figures that had gathered, from the ash, from the wind's quick breath in the cane, from the little bells inside the ears that ring in the aftermath of lightning. The payment has been made. The circle is complete. The land will take what it is owed. Judge Treadwell pulled the stopper from the bottle the priest had given him, and threw the contents hard into the circle. Where it fell, the ground hissed like iron plunged into water and a thin steam rose. In that steam they all saw fragments, not memories exactly, but pieces of a work too large to hold at once. A woman in this very parish 2 lifetimes ago standing in a ring of pine resin. An old man on a coastline farther east cutting a circle in sand and speaking to the tide. A gathering in a swamp by lantern light. Women in headscarves and women in silk gloves pouring words into the same vessel. The steam thinned. The air steadied. Charlotte reached into the satchel and drew out a small bundle wrapped in something that looked like burial cloth and shone wet where lamplight touched it. It moved. The men around the circle flinched. The bundle moved again and took a breath you could hear without ears. Charlotte's belly tightened and released as if a wave had passed through her. From inside her, from inside the bundle, from inside the ruined foundation, from inside the land, many heartbeats braided into a single multiplied cry. The cattle in the far pasture lifted their heads and answered with that long tone again, the one that sounds like a hymn sung by throats that have just learned they are allowed to sing. The men at the edge of the ash took one step back together, as if the ground had asked them to make room. Lantern light shook. The night drew closer and then widened. The river spoke in her sleep. and the circle waited for its last motion. For a long moment the knight forgot how to move. Lantern light trembled and steadied. Ash settled in a ring that looked cut with a blade made of silence. The circle waited for the last motion the way a chest waits at the top of a held breath. Charlotte lifted the bundle. The cloth shone wet where lamplight struck it. Something inside pressed outward with a patient intelligence, as if learning the limits of a room. The air thinned. The men at the edge of the ash felt a pressure that pushed at the hinges of the heart. Charlotte's belly clenched and released. From within her, from within the bundle, from within the ground, many heartbeats braided into one multiplied cry. It was newborn and not newborn. It was morning taught to sing. The cattle in the far pasture raised their heads and answered with that long tone that had already visited the day. A hymn from throats that did not know hymns belonged to them. Shadows crowded the circle. They were the shapes of people who had stood here months before. Sold away, fever taken. Names erased in ledgers and preserved under tongues. Older shapes pressed in as well. The kind that belonged to no parish calendar and no courthouse seal. Charlotte spoke true names and the shadows thickened, as if breath returned through a door that had been nailed, and then found its own hinge judge. Treadwell's fingers worked the little flask the priest had given him. He pulled the stopper and threw. The fall of holy water met the ground with a hiss like iron plunged into a trough. Steam uncurled. In that curtain of breath, the men saw fragments of a work too large to see at once. Women in headscarves and women in silk gloves in rooms far apart, shaping the same pattern without speaking each other's names. A circle of pine resin in 1815. A fisherman cutting signs into sand at dawn and whispering to the tide. A swamp gathering where lanterns drew small stars down into water. The pattern knit and unknit and knit again. The steam thinned. Charlotte unwrapped the cloth. What lay inside did not choose an age. It swelled infant soft, then lengthened, then became small again as if time were a dress being tried on in a hurry. Features shifted and settled and shifted. African cheekbone, French mouth, Choctaw eye, a line from a face that would not be born until a century later. The bundle breathed and stood on legs that did not learn so much as remember. Theodore raised his pistol. His hand shook. Charlotte's eyes rolled forward and found him for a single clear breath. A sadness the size of a river moved across her face. A knowledge as sharp as a blade followed it. "It is already done," she said. The words rose from her lips and from the white in her eyes, and from the ash and from the small bells that ring after lightning. "The payment has been made. The circle is complete. The land will take what it is owed." The pistol lowered, not by choice exactly, by gravity discovering a new rule. The bundle child lifted its head. In its eyes lived a patience that had waited through centuries for a door to open. When it spoke, no single language owned the sound. The words touched French, Yoruba, Latin, Choctaw, the salt grammar of sailors, the careful cadence of a parish clerk, and the soft country talk of women at laundry stones. All those voices carried the same simple claim. I am the debt made flesh. I am the sorrow given form. I am what you owe and cannot repay. I am here to remember and in remembering to balance the scales. Theodore dropped to his knees. The child came to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. That hand was infant smooth and elder-lined at the same instant. It leaned and spoke into his ear a sentence no other man would ever hear. He screamed once, a sound that tore a path through the night and left the edges glowing. His eyes filled with a fear that knew its own name. Charlotte's body convulsed, not in pain, in something that looked terribly like ecstasy. The shadows moved as if pulled by a tide. They flowed into her through skin and eyes and breath. They flowed into the child. The lantern flames leaned toward the circle. Dust lifted and spun. Leaves that had fallen months before rose and turned in a pattern that would match an astronomer's chart half a century in the future. Dr. Henley stepped forward and caught his balance in a single shocked motion. In that step the world uncurtained. He saw a ledger made of soil, debits and credits recorded in blood and song. He understood without words that this was not a summoning and not a possession. It was a birth, and it belonged to more than bodies. It belonged to the ground itself, which had carried a weight past bearing and now insisted on being heard. Then the air let go. Silence dropped hard. The child wavered as if made of breath on winter glass. It looked at each man in turn. In that look lived every face that should have grown from this land and did not. Then it dissolved the way fog dissolves at sunrise. Not gone. Changed state. Charlotte collapsed gently, as if laid down by careful hands. Her belly fell silent. Her nightgown, once a script, faded to ordinary cloth. The judge leaned against the post and found it was the only time in his life a piece of wood had felt like mercy. The overseers lowered their iron and salt. In the dim light, every man present wore new lines at the mouth and temple. Their hair showed threads of gray that had not been there at supper. Their hands trembled like the hands of men who have come back from a place that has no roads in and no roads out. They carried Charlotte to the house. Madame Arseno walked beside without touching. The candles on the gallery burned steady, then green again, then steady. In the hallway mirror, a hairline crack ran from top, cornered a bottom and drew a path toward a city the house had never visited but would soon meet in quiet ways. 3 days passed. Charlotte slept as if traveling underwater. The doctor kept watch and wrote notes in a hand that wanted to break. He examined a body that showed no sign of illness. And yet when he placed his hand on her abdomen, he felt the knowledge that this body had labored and delivered. Not once, not twice, but many times, though no scar told that story. He folded that page under another and pressed his palm flat on the paper, as if pressure could teach truth to wait. While she slept, the house changed. Every mirror cracked on its own schedule. The patterns were not random. Some formed maps of safe routes that would not be spoken of in town for another decade. Some stitched a string of small handprints that matched the number of cabins in the southern row. A guest shaving glass broke into the exact diagram that a conductor would carry years later, under the name Gabriel. The large hall mirror held a thin corridor of light that pointed to a quiet door in New Orleans, where a woman with a red scarf would listen before she agreed to open. The library rearranged itself, not by alphabet and not by subject. By weight, not the weight of paper. The weight of sorrow. Books that held simple pleasures moved high. Books that held theft moved low and close. A visitor would later swear that when he stood in the doorway, he could feel how the room had learned to breathe like a chest after a long cry. In the quarters, every person dreamed the same dream on the same night. A child walked the row. The face changed with each step, set a bloody hand on each door. The print glowed and faded, and left a sense that the wood had learned a new word. People woke with knowledge no mouth had carried to them. A woman knew the true name of a sister sold to Georgia and the crossroad where a signal would be left. A man knew which 2 overseers would stand back when a certain blow was struck, and which one would not. A girl who had never been to town knew how to move through Baton Rouge without being seen. A boy who had been born hungry knew which house in New Orleans would feed a stranger who did not ask for a name. By the 3rd day, Charlotte opened her eyes and looked around a room that knew far more about her than she remembered about it. She smiled politely. She asked what day it was. She asked whether anyone had watered the lemon tree. She did not recall the keeping house or the ash or the child of changing age. She touched her abdomen and frowned a little, as one does at a shadow that does not stay where light should put it. The doctor told her she was very well. He did not say the other part. He had learned which truths demand silence to keep from breaking the people who hear them. Madame Arseno vanished. Her room held no trace. Wax soothed into the seams of windows had gone hard and then gone missing. The needles with their small shimmering marks were not in their case. The pattern on the floor of the prepared room had faded to an almost memory, as if it had been written on skin and then carried away into the wider body of the house. When Theodore tried to picture her face, it slipped like a reflection in wind-ruffled water. He could remember the weight of her presence, but not the shape of it. Father Jean-Baptiste Duchesne arrived on December 30, with a small case and a face shaped by long acquaintance with sorrow. He stepped from the carriage and stood still until his lungs matched the rhythm of the place. The yard smelled of ash and cut cane. The air over the bare foundation held a warmth that did not belong to noon. He greeted Theodore in the study and listened without interrupting. The senator's voice carried the rasp of a man who had slept too hard and woken too quickly. When the telling faltered, the priest opened his case. Inside lay oil, a worn book, a rope of prayers polished by older hands, and a pouch of earth from a churchyard that no longer existed. He touched each tool as one greets an old friend. "I will not cast anything out," he said gently. "There is nothing here to bind. The land has remembered. Our work is to name what has happened and steady the house while it finishes speaking." They walked the rooms. Mirrors showed hairline maps that made the priest pause with a hand lifted, as if listening to a far bell. In the library, he felt the rearranged weight of the books and murmured a line from Scripture about scales and measures. In the prepared room, he knelt and set his fingers on the faded geometry. He rose with a slow breath as a man does when he recognizes a path he once swore he had only dreamed. He asked to see Charlotte. She received him with courtesy and a light in her eyes that did not belong to memory. She did not know him. He knew her. He anointed her brow and spoke words that had comforted sailors, midwives, and men who had learned too late that power is not the same as safety. He asked no questions and offered no verdict. When he finished, the room felt as if a window had been opened for one brief, clean breath. In the quarters, Father Duchesne walked without hurry. He greeted people by the names they used among themselves and was greeted in turn with a careful nod. He stepped to the edge of the bare foundation and did not cross. He removed his hat. He prayed the simplest prayer he knew, one that asks for justice to come like rain, and for memory to do its work without drowning the living. The ground seemed to soften underfoot, not as surrender, as assent. His letter to New Orleans left that evening with Benedict's chosen rider. In it he wrote that the parish would record nothing, yet everything had already been recorded where it mattered. He wrote that this was not a prodigy to display, or a scandal to suppress. It was a balancing. He urged that no public rite be attempted, only private care. He closed with 4 words: honor what has entered. The days that followed moved with a new clarity. Theodore summoned his overseer, his lawyer, and the senior house staff. He stood at the study window with hands that had finally stilled, and spoke a set of decisions that stripped him of standing among planters and restored to him something he had not known he could keep. He freed every person held on his land. He set aside deeds to small plots and coin for a first season. He signed papers with a hand that no longer shook. News spread in the only way it could, quickly, quietly. Families gathered in the quarters without song or shout. Some wept openly. Others sat and held each other's wrists as if to feel the pulse in a beloved vein. A mother lifted her child and spoke a true name into the soft place above the ear. In the big house kitchens, women set aside extra food without being asked and carried it where it needed to go. That night, every mirror in the house cracked again. Not a shattering, a single new line, delicate as a hair, that ran along the first pattern and ended at a place on the glass where the lamplight gathered like a coin. Professor Brenner returned to the hotel and wrote until his hand cramped. He did not try to make the sentences respectable. He made them true. He wrote that a woman had served as a bridge between worlds, and that a network of women across the South had laid the timbers for that crossing long before any visitor arrived to name it. He wrote that the work was not a summoning of darkness, but a midwifing of memory. He sealed the pages with a care usually reserved for wills. He kept one line for himself, copied on a slip and tucked under his watch. The land speaks. We must learn to answer without lying. The house softened. Charlotte walked the gallery at dusk with a lamp in her hand. Light followed her into rooms that had forgotten softness. She hosted tea as before, yet her attention slid toward places that held old sorrow. She sent letters no one knew how to trace. A parcel of papers appeared with an elderly free man in town, who had once signed away a claim he did not fully understand. The papers taught him how to take it back. A small sack of coins found its way to a door near the ferry, where the woman in the red scarf listened for knocks that carried the right silence. At night, Charlotte kept lamps burning. When a flame guttered, she woke with a cry and reached for a child that was not in the room. The doctor taught the maids to trim wicks without smoke and left extra oil. No one spoke of it in her presence. During the day, she smiled easily. In quiet moments, her fingers traced signs in the air that felt like writing and looked like prayer. Theodore began to draft laws that would have made his colleagues stare if he had dared to read them aloud. He wrote of reparations due to living people for theft recorded by Scripture and by soil. He wrote of land that would pass to the hands that had cultivated it. He wrote of the right to gather in worship without a watcher. He wrote of a future his own generation would not see, and sent these papers to no one. The act of writing cleared the fog from his lungs. He slept better. Not easily. Better. Father Duchesne departed with a brief blessing on the threshold and a hand pressed hard on Theodore's shoulder. He left behind no public sign and one private gift. On a small scrap of linen he had written a set of words to be spoken in any room where fear returned at midnight. The maid who found it told Charlotte. The two of them spoke those words once together, and did not need them again for many nights. Winter passed in a parish that barely knows the word. The cane stubble stood gray against low sun. The river shoulders turned slow and heavy. The bare circle in the yard refused grass. On certain nights singing rose from that place. Not eerie, strong. A line of work song braided to a hymn and older notes whose names have been forgotten. People stopped where they stood and listened with heads tilted and hands quiet. Some wept, some smiled. Everyone understood that listening was an act. Months later, a boy was born to Charlotte and Theodore. A birth that followed the rules of bodies and left the doctor relieved and humbled. The child carried eyes that looked like they had already learned to read. As he grew, he touched objects and told stories about their owners that no one had told him. He walked at night with sure feet and returned at dawn with a look that said he had traveled without leaving the yard. When a map of safe houses began to whisper up and down the river in years to come, a hand with his patience and precision would be visible in its careful routes. He would not sign his name. Others would call him by a name that sounded like a trumpet. Gabriel. The plantation's economy never recovered its old confidence. Cane stood high and sweet, then darkened and failed as harvest neared. Buyers came, spent a single night, and fled with faces like men who had swallowed a handful of broken glass. The land refused to sell itself into another forgetting. The senator learned to let go of wealth the way a man releases a breath he has held too long. In time, the big house would burn cold, and a field of flowers no one could name would claim the foundation on 2 dates each year. People would come and stand at the edge and say nothing at all. Professor Brenner grew thin and gray, and content with that. His colleagues declined his papers with elegant regret. He kept writing. He sent a single copy to a convent in New Orleans, where a nun who had once prepared a body for burial recognized the hand of truth and hid the parcel where cautious eyes would overlook it. He died with a sentence half finished and a look of relief that someone mistook for satisfaction. Marie Claire lived long. She left Baton Rouge for a time and returned when it became clear that the work here had not finished with her. She taught quietly. She moved names from wrong pages to right ones. She placed a paper in the hands of a woman who needed to leave under starlight. She showed a child how to listen for the sound a key makes in the pocket of a man who thinks he is alone. Years turned. The story pressed itself into the habits of a city that does not like to admit what it knows. Locals avoided the old ground after dark without remembering why. Now and then someone heard singing that did not belong to any single time. Now and then a mirror cracked and led a traveler toward a door in a different town, where safety waited behind a question and the right small answer. The ledger that mattered had learned to carry its own pen. As for the house, it kept the word the priest had given it. Mercy, a word with muscle, a word that remembers the cost. It hung in the air like a faint spice. People breathed it in without thinking. When they spoke it aloud, they did so softly, as if not to startle a bird asleep on a sill, and the land kept saying its old verbs, steady as tide. Remember, return. When the Mississippi ran slow and the night sweated, when lantern light turned the color of limes, when a mother reached for a child and found only breath but felt no despair, you could almost hear another word join the others. Begin.